From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And here's what's coming up. K-State's Katie Reif will talk about the new research project she'll be heading up, which will seek effective ways of controlling or possibly preventing anaplasmosis disease in cattle herds. The USDA has just provided a major grant to support this multi-layered study. This week's Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State features Bob Larson, Brad White, and Dustin Pendell. This time they'll discuss heat synchronization for heifers, and they'll take a look at an international initiative on prioritizing government investments in livestock disease control. And further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee reports on a new survey on backyard bird feeding practices. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is the Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today. As always, we're glad to have you along with us. And we report first on a new grant to the College of Veterinary Medicine here at Kansas State University, provided by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And it's to address what is an increasingly notorious disease in beef cattle production. It's known as anaplasmosis. You've heard about it before, to be sure. The individual who will be steering this work is with us now. She is an assistant professor in the Diagnostic Medicine and Pathobiology Department, Katie Reif. And Katie, this is going to be hopefully an exciting result when this project is completed, and we'll get into all that. But first of all, I might ask you to provide us a refresher on anaplasmosis and the severity of this disease in the cattle industry.
Sure. So I'd like to begin by saying that anaplasmosis is actually a really important problem for the global cattle industry. It's the number one vector-borne disease in the world. And then specifically in the United States, it's estimated to cost about $300 million per year to the cattle industry. In a recent survey that my group collaborated with Dr. Greg Hanslacek in the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State, we did a survey to look at the prevalence of anaplasmosis in the state of Kansas. And through a combination of both of our work, we found that about 47% of beef cattle herds in the state were actively infected with the bacteria that causes this disease. And on the eastern third of Kansas, about 80% of beef cattle herds were actively infected with this disease. That's
almost overwhelming. It truly is a serious situation. And the ill effects of anaplas, you might remind us of those.
Sure. So in animals that acquire the disease, the number one hallmark of the disease is really severe anemia, which can lead to death. And all of the other symptoms and clinical signs associated with this disease are associated with this initial anemia. The bacteria itself lives in the red blood cells of cattle, and as the bacteria is getting cleared out by the spleen of the animal or the bacteria is destroying those red cells, that's what leads to this very severe anemia.
And why has it been so difficult to get ahead of it? There is no, up to now, any reliable preventative approach to anaplas?
Correct. So there's two options that cattle producers have to treat anaplasmosis or to control anaplasmosis. So first is using injectable oxytetracycline in animals exhibiting clinical signs. But data has shown, research has shown previously that single or even double inoculations of oxytetracycline don't reliably clear the infection. They basically just blunt the infection. So they knock it back, but they don't completely eliminate it. And then in herds that are actively infected but aren't necessarily showing clinical signs, the producers, their only antimicrobial option is to use chlorotetracycline medicated feed or mineral. And the dose that the FDA currently allows is a subtherapeutic level, which means that it also is not clearing the infection. It's just trying to dampen it down. So neither of the two measures that producers have available to them actually eliminates the infection.
And that brings us to your intent with this project, which is, by the way, being supported by a $1.2 million grant from the USDA. What's the tactic you're planning to look at here in your work, Katie?
Sure. So first, the main question that we want to answer is to definitively assess or determine whether or not the FDA's currently approved chlorotetracycline regimen is dulling or clearing anaplasmosis from infected animals. We also know that there is a lot of different strains of Anaplasma marginale, which is the name of the bacteria that causes anaplasmosis. So when we're testing the FDA-approved treatment regimens, we want to be mindful of the fact that there's lots of different strains. So last summer, we actually went out and we isolated 2 strains from beef cattle herds in southeast Kansas. And then we have another 2 strains that we're going to use. So we're going to infect a bunch of cattle with different strains of Anaplasma marginale and test different treatment levels or regimens of this chlorotetracycline antimicrobial and see if it's actually working to prevent disease or to reduce bacterial burdens. That hasn't been recently studied. And at the same time, we know that continually using antibiotics can potentially lead to resistance as well. And so a lot of herds that use chlorotetracycline for multiple months out of the year, they still see problems with this disease. And so we want to determine whether or not resistance is starting to develop in our target pathogen, which is Anaplasma marginale. So we'll do some genetic assessment as well, sequence the genome of these strains to see if there's any indication that resistance is developing.
You have hopes that by amending the use of chlorotetracycline in the means that you're going to, that this will render results and actually put away this infection or at least severely cripple it.
Yes. So the dosages that we're testing are, 2 of the dosages are going to be the high and the low end of the current approved range that the FDA has approved. And then we're also going to be testing an experimentally high dose to see if we can knock back or knock out this organism with any of the dosages so that we can make recommendations to the FDA to say you have to treat with this much or for this long in order to control your anaplas problem. There's also no duration of use limit on how long a producer can feed this medicated feed or mineral, and it's really expensive to feed this medicated feed or mineral. So if we can provide concrete evidence to say, if you're going to undergo the expense of treating your animals for this disease, here's a good time frame to do so in, and we're going to target that time frame in relation to the life cycle of the bacteria in the animal as well.
So this will take place over, the next 2 or 3 years' time? What?
So the grant is a 4-year grant. Last year was the year we isolated our strains that we're using for our controlled experiment. And then this year we're doing the controlled experiment. It'll take about, almost the entire full year where we're going to be infecting our cattle and treating with these different doses. And then this bacteria is also transmitted most naturally by ticks. So we're going to be doing different experiments where we have ticks pick up the bacteria and transmit it before and after treatment to see if anaplasma is becoming resistant to antibiotics, if that resistance is maintained through tick passage as well. Another unique aspect of this project is that we're not only looking at the effect of antimicrobial usage on our target pathogen specifically, which is Anaplasma marginale, but antibiotics, they don't only affect one thing, they affect multiple microbial species within a host. So we're really interested to see how treatment for anaplasmosis is having off-target effects on other microbial species in cattle, and namely in the GI tract or the intestinal tract of cattle. If treatment for anaplasmosis is also potentially promoting the development of resistance in these E. coli and Salmonella, things that are shed by the cattle and that are much more of a public health concern in and of themselves. And then another really exciting part of this proposal is that we want our results to be really applicable to the producer, a really short pipeline to them. So while we're going through the project, we're going to be having these producer-oriented anaplasmosis symposium where we're going to be sharing the goals of the projects and then the result of the project as well.
And since you bring it up, the first of those is already slated for the latter part of May, you say, taking place here in Manhattan.
Yes, correct. We're really excited, and we have a really good slate of speakers that have been invited and that are going to speak on all aspects of the disease and treatment and control options that we know. We also are going to have an interactive producer panel where we've invited various producers to come on up and just speak to how they control this disease in their herds, and that should be a lot of fun.
And for one, to find out more about that particular event, for it, as you say, is producer-oriented. Veterinarians as well can attend, anybody who'd had any stake in anaplasmosis control. How might they sign up for that?
So the best phone number where they can call and get information is 785-532-4528. It's the KSU Vet Med Alumni and Events. And that phone number, once again, is 785-532-4528. If you're on any of the email blast lists through the Beef Cattle Institute or Animal Science, you may receive an email flyer for this as well.
On Monday, the 20th of May, Symposium on Bovine Anaplasmosis. The venue will be the Hilton Garden Inn here in Manhattan, so get that on your calendar. Katie, in closing, wishing you and your colleagues all the best as you undertake this, and thanks for the briefing. We'll have you back for an update as this goes along, if we might.
Perfect.
She is Katie Reif, and she's an assistant professor in the Diagnostic Medicine and Pathobiology Department of K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine. Again, a research grant just bestowed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to her department for $1.2 million, supporting work here at K-State toward combating anaplasmosis disease in cattle. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll return shortly here on the K-State Radio Network. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. This is Agriculture Today, and up next, information that was shared in the latest Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. This week, the BCI team talks about an international food animal health initiative that one of them is involved with, and they'll follow up on a topic from the previous podcast. Here are livestock economist Dustin Pendell, veterinarian Bob Larson, and your moderator, veterinarian Brad White.
One of the things we're going to discuss is synchronization programs in heifers. Now, last week, we talked about synchronization program in cows. A little bit different in heifers.
A little bit different. I mean, obviously, some of the technology is the same, but the advantages are a little bit different.
But to start off with, Dustin, you went to Paris. Tell us a little bit about that.
So, I was in Paris last week for 3 days, worth of meetings to talk about something called a global burden of animal disease.
So where did that idea come from?
Well, it came from something on the human side called the global burden of disease. And so there's a group out of University of Washington called the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. And so what they've been doing for probably 20, 30 years is they've been collecting data on human health diseases. And what they've really been trying to do is track diseases, types of diseases by countries, but really they're interested in the productivity, the lost productivity as a result of various diseases. That information then is given to policymakers and researchers, and then they can focus what are the priorities, what should we be
investing from a productivity standpoint.
What should we be investing in?
So probably diseases in young people are ranked higher than older because of lack of productivity.
And it varies by country, by region, et cetera.
What are you saying, older people aren't as productive?
Well, yes. From a national economy standpoint, I think that'd be true.
I guess.
All right, so we better start talking about animals. So
then there's also something called there's a foodborne, global burden of foodborne as well. And so now where this came from is, hey, we're different. Animals are different than humans. Animals, at least what we think here in the U.S., are primarily source of
fiber.
Food. Yeah. But then if you get over into developing countries, that's a source of
then you've got
draft
power.
Yeah. And so brought this team together. This has probably been in the works for several years now. They brought us together a year ago. We were all at the World Animal Health Organization in Paris, OIE, a year ago to talk about this idea. They brought people from all over the world, all kinds of backgrounds, statisticians, epidemiologists, economists, etc. They've had a vision. We've been working over the last year. There was several teams. You've got a team just on economists looking at we call it the wider economic impacts as a result of them. Disease prioritization, which disease should we be focusing on, those kinds of things, which countries. Anyway, so they brought us all back together to figure out what we've learned. What we're trying to do is, why we're different than the humans is, with the human side, they measure the productivity losses.
Like work days lost.
You get sick, you're out of work.
Right.
It's a little more complex with the animal side because you do have the productivity losses, and that's straightforward. We can measure that. But you also have the expenditures to eradicate and control diseases. Again, we can measure that. But there's a third component that we don't have to think about on the human side, and that's international trade. Right?
Yeah, sure. Because of trade barriers, for good reasons to keep diseases out, but then that influences the movement.
And so we can also measure that as well if you've got the data.
But that's beginning to be complicated now.
So now you can imagine in all the varying developing countries, et cetera. And so what we're trying to do is to collect the data and to come up with economic impacts, such as, so just take foot and mouth disease, right? What is the total global burden of animal disease for foot and mouth? We could break that out by country. We could break that out by species type. You could break that out by region. And then if you've got, let's say, foot and mouth, then you pick a couple other diseases, TB, ASF, and you got all these diseases for a country. Hopefully the research or the policymakers can then say, where should I invest my money?
Right. Either attacking the most important diseases or things that impact more than one disease.
And so right now, some of the arguments are in some of the countries, well, we're going to study FMD because that's where our researchers at our institute, they know FMD, they're really good at it. And so they're not necessarily investing the money in the right places. They're investing it in a particular disease because that's what they've been studying for the last 10 years. And it might not be relevant.
It sounds like a good project.
So this could direct research funding. So as you prioritize and say, okay, here's the global burden of this animal disease, that might merit more research dollars than something else.
And so, for example, we might invest a whole bunch of money in a particular disease here in the U.S., when in reality, we should be investing in other diseases, other maybe emerging diseases. And so, yes, absolutely, it'll help hopefully direct where maybe research dollars should go or dollars towards prevention.
Yeah. And that makes perfect sense as far as how do you measure that disease and then how do we measure change, right? So even if you put research or preventative dollars in it, we don't have a great metric for globally measuring change. We can do that on an operational level or maybe even a national level, but it's hard to do across the world.
Yep. And so, long run, this is a big project. You got to collect data, do all this, but hopefully help USDA, for example, say, hey, this is where we maybe should prioritize.
Wow. These are the important diseases.
Yeah.
So one of the other topics, and we talked last week, and I'm going to shift here. We talked last week about synchronization programs and in cows. And to recap, if you weren't listening on that podcast, to recap, we said there's sometimes that may pay, it may not pay to synchronize commercial cows, and we gave the reasons for that and listed some explanation. But this week, I want to change the topic a little bit. And Bob, I'm going to ask you, synchronization program in heifers, and I'm going to define our heifers as the ones that have never had a calf, but we're targeting them to calve by 2 years old.
Right, so they're going to get pregnant for their first pregnancy, going to calve at 2 years of age. And while I agree that on the cow side, sometimes synchronization is a good idea, sometimes it isn't. On heifers, I think very, very often it is. These are heifers that we can really, as long as we've selected heifers that are going to reach puberty by the time we're going to start the synchronization program or have a very high likelihood to do that, we should have pretty good success. In other words, so our cost per pregnancy is controlled if we have a high percentage of those heifers that are cycling.
So what's good success?
Okay.
What are your expectations from this? How many pregnancies are we going to get?
Okay. Well, more than 50%. And a lot of times my goal is really closer to 60%. A lot of that does have to do with how much selection pressure I put on those heifers to be already cycling. So the more pressure I put on heifers so that they're older, they're heavier, they're already cycling, I should be able to get to 60% or so AI pregnancies. If I put less selection pressure on that, maybe 50%.
Does the type of synchronization, will the synchronization program help them start cycling? So if they're not cycling, will it help them start?
Yes, it will. Most of the protocols that we use nowadays use a progestogen or progesterone, and those will help jumpstart heifers that are approaching puberty. But like I tell the students all the time, you can nudge Mother Nature, but you can't fool her. So when I say it'll jumpstart the heifers, it'd be heifers that are pretty close to start cycling to reach puberty, and it will move them up a few days, or maybe even a couple of weeks. And so that's one of the advantages of a synchronization protocol, is to kind of ensure that a higher percentage of heifers are cycling.
Because that progestin, so if we don't administer progestin to a heifer, or progesterone, her internal is kind of vacillating as she approaches puberty. So this helps as she's getting close to that stage. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly right. So it's a good tool that we have to ensure that a lot of heifers have reached puberty by the start of breeding. And then when we synchronize them, we can use AI bulls that are really optimized for breeding heifers. So high calving ease, low birth weight types of bulls, which is really important for controlling the amount of calving difficulty we have in those heifers. And those really high calving ease bulls that still have adequate growth are pretty rare, but we can find them in AI sires.
So two potential advantages you're outlining there. One, we might be able to get a few more of the heifers cycling, and we get them cycling early in the season. And two, we can be more selective with our bulls. Because if I go find a cleanup bull for heifers, my primary concern is that he's calving ease. Right. I'm not going to have calving difficulty.
And I'm probably going to have to sacrifice quite a bit of weaning weight to be assured that I get good calving ease bulls on the bulls that I can buy locally from a natural service standpoint.
Because they don't have the accuracy on their EP. I mean, they have EPDs. Is it accuracy related compared to
it's a little bit accuracy
AI?
Related because young bulls don't have the accuracy of a proven AI sire that has thousands of offspring. And again, just those two traits, we say that they antagonize each other. So low birth weights tend to align with lower weaning weights. And so what we're looking for is those few individuals where that is kind of broken, that you get pretty low birth weights, but still really good weaning weights. Well, those individuals are rare. And because they're rare, they're identified, they're valuable, and they're a lot of times an AI sire.
So with those advantages, getting a few more heifers cycling and being able to really select the genetics that we need to put into that herd with some accuracy, AI in heifers, most of the time a good idea? Is it on your recommendation list?
I would say it's always at least something to consider, whether or not it's implemented. And you have to still look at facilities, labor, other attributes of the ranching situation. But I think it should always be looked at. Whereas with cows, I think probably fewer operations where it's going to be a slam dunk win. I think with synchronizing and AIing heifers, it's something that producers really ought to look at.
So there was some good work done by Rick Funston in Nebraska, and they looked at heifers, and if they calved in that first 21-day period compared to heifers that calved in the third 21-day period, they weaned more body weight over their lifetime and stayed in the herd for longer. So when she calves that first time is critical, AI is a good way to help move them up to the front.
Totally agree.
From the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State, that's Brad White, Bob Larson, and Dustin Pendell. This is just an excerpt from the latest Cattle Chat podcast. Listen to it in its entirety at beefcattleinstitute.org, beefcattleinstitute.org. This is Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. Now today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. And the Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report for this week from the USDA tells us this. For the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies still more than ample around the state. 14% surplus, 83% adequate, only 3% short to very short, while subsoil moisture is at 14% surplus as well and 84% adequate, only 2% short to very short. The condition of the Kansas winter wheat crop this week is at 59% good to excellent, 31% fair, 10% poor to very poor. Winter wheat at the jointing stage, 26% as of the past weekend. That's ahead of the 21% last year, but well behind the 46% for the 5-year average. And corn planting in Kansas, 6% done now. That's well behind the 14% average for the state, according to the USDA. As for the national numbers on winter wheat conditions and corn planting progress, here's the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey has the latest progress report for winter wheat.
Even though it's a slow-developing crop, most of it looks pretty good. We're steady for a second consecutive week at 60% good to excellent and just 9% very poor to poor. Huge improvement over last year's drought-affected crop when we had drought across the central and southern Great Plains.
Last year at this time, 31% of the crop was considered good to excellent and 37% was considered very poor to poor.
So we have the heading progress for the week ending April 14th, and that shows 6% of the nation's crop has headed out on that date. 5-year average is 9%, last year 8%.
He says nearly all winter wheat production states are at or delayed in terms of heading. Crop progress this week has not been outstanding. Take, for example, corn.
We do see national progress inching forward from 2 to 3% of the intended acreage planted by April 14th, and that is starting to fall behind the 5-year average of 5%.
Corn planting progress is equal to the same time last year.
The only Midwestern states showing any progress at all, Missouri and Indiana. Looking at those two, Missouri, just 6% of the acreage planted for corn, 5-year average 15%. And before that storm moved in, Indiana, 1% of the intended acreage planted, which puts them on par with the 5-year average.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
The Trump administration is preparing now to boost high-speed mobile data, considered next generation or 5G, as well as roll out a $20 billion fund to increase rural broadband access. The FCC announced that plan just days after a Senate Commerce Committee hearing criticized the agency for its broadband maps. Critics claim that those maps inflated actual broadband access in rural America. But in announcing the 5G expansion, FCC Chairman Ajit Pai said that the FCC didn't want to see rural America left behind. As the Washington Post described the announcement, the FCC will release a wide swath of high-frequency airwaves for cellular use, which will be the largest trove of U.S. wireless spectrum ever to be auctioned off. To help expand rural broadband, Pai said the FCC will also create that new $20.4 billion Rural Digital Opportunity Fund at the agency. The funds will expand high-speed broadband to 4 million homes and businesses in rural America. According to Pai, that new fund could begin later this year. Next up on Agriculture Today, the weekly feature for you dairy producers, milk lines. Here's K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I went to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning the upcoming alfalfa harvest. As things start to green up this spring, the alfalfa is already growing at a fairly rapid pace. It's time to think about the first harvest and when we're going to pull that for maximum forage quality. If we're really looking for maximum forage quality out of the first cutting, need to be thinking early bud. Obviously, at early bud stage, there should not be any blooms out there in the field, and we need to have the equipment ready so that when we get to early bud, we can go in and quickly harvest. Again, weather is always a concern for us, and if we're going to harvest that first crop as a silage or haylage crop, that will reduce our rain risk because we will spend fewer days in the field trying to get that crop harvested and into the storage structure as opposed to dry hay. So that may be one thing you might want to consider in your plans. If you're going to be putting up haylage anyway, maybe the first cutting is an excellent crop to take for that so that we can reduce the exposure to weather as we wait for that crop to dry down. Once we get the first cutting taken, one of the things we're going to need to consider is how long do we wait between cuttings. It's something I think most of our Kansas farmers should think about. If we look at what we normally do, we normally wait 28 to 30 days between alfalfa cuttings. Again, weather will impact this a little bit. But what kind of quality do you actually harvest when you wait that long? I think many times we'll find that on a relative feed value, it's hard to get above 160. Ideally for dairy animals, we'd like to be at 180 or above. As we look at the number of days between cuttings, a lot of the recommendations we actually utilize are those that are utilized other places, say in Colorado, at higher elevations than what we're at, and with less growing stress because they have cooler nights. If we want this very similar type of forage quality that they harvest there at 28 or 30 days as a cutting interval, may mean that we need to take our crop just a little bit earlier, maybe at 24 days. Now, there's some obvious differences when we do that. If you take it at 24 days, the plant is going to be at a younger maturity. It will have less neutral detergent fiber and less acid detergent fiber, and that fiber should be more available to your dairy cows than if you wait until it's 28 or 30 days between the cuttings. Now, will you give up a little on yield if you do that? Yes, you will. But if you think about it, over the growing season, you will likely gain an additional cutting. That additional cutting will generally more than make up for the loss in dry matter harvest that you had in the previous cuttings. So as you approach your alfalfa harvesting this summer, I'd like to encourage you to think about ways that you could improve the forage quality. That might mean that we need to take those cuttings just a little bit closer together. Yes, we will give up just a little bit of yield each time we do it, but we should gain an additional cutting during the year. And most of all, we should gain an increase in the alfalfa quality, which should result in an increase in the productivity of our dairy herd. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to begin thinking about alfalfa harvests for the summer.
Thanks, Mike. And we'll be back in just a few moments. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today is back now, and Mike's side with us once more to visit about another wildlife management topic is Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie will look closely at an activity that is so favored by tons of homeowners out there, backyard bird feeding, and as a scientific undertaking, to put it that way, which we'll talk of, but highly popular, this activity.
Backyard bird feeding is very popular. It's probably the most common used form of wildlife management. As we increase urbanization, feeding wild birds is one of the few remaining ways that many humans can really connect with nature and see the benefits of direct interaction with wildlife. Although most forms of intentional feeding of wildlife, particularly big game and small game populations, is actively discouraged by many wildlife biologists, backyard bird feeding remains popular and is encouraged by many wildlife professionals. In the United States, there's over 55 million households that are feeding backyard birds, and they're spending over $4 billion annually on bird food. So you can see that that's a lot of people spending a lot of money But the question then becomes, what are the impacts, are there ecological impacts on bird populations as a result of this many people conducting backyard bird feeding? The science shows that there can result in positive effects on some bird species, such as overwinter survival. We can get increases in population sizes, and we can get geographical range expansion. The data is very clear on those benefits, but there are also studies that show there's some potential negative effects, such as increased risk of depredation. That may be by cats or by hawks, or increased in the disease and diseases spread. So the question in this particular study is, those people that are feeding backyard birds, are they observing any of the positive or negative effects of feeding? And if so, are they willing to share those results on what's happening in their individual yards with scientists?
So this study enlisted the help of what you're calling citizen scientists here in making these observations and learning something from their individual feeding activity in their backyard areas. And tell about the things they were looking at and the level of response to that.
Well, they selected people to complete an online survey of citizen scientists who were selected from a group of people that participate in the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in a project called Feeder Watch. That's a 2-day reporting period where approximately 11,000 participants record the numbers of birds of each species that they see simultaneously at their feeders over a 2-day time frame. This particular survey was conducted by professionals from Virginia Tech, from Cornell, from the University of Georgia, and they asked a subset of those folks, about 2,000, got responses from about 60% of those folks, some very significant questions about what they observed and what actions did they take as a result of those observations. And then they coupled that with the emotional connections at these scenarios, and was their emotions a result of more or less action to try to improve conditions for birds. So the survey was conducted, they analyzed the data, and found some fairly interesting conclusions. Many reported managing predators and maintaining feeders was certainly an important management technique. They recognized that incidents of disease and the presence of predators with increased and decreased bird abundance. They showed a variety of emotional responses to the scenarios that were presented, such as depredation or disease at their feeders. Some they could recognize disease symptoms, others they did not. Many of them said they would take action as a result of seeing some of the depredation events or diseases. Those action types really varied. It could be included things as try to frighten the predators away from the feeders, changing feeder designs, perhaps changing the feed. They also reported in response to disease that they would look at things like cleaning their feeders more regularly or putting other feeders out. But overall, they thought the main benefit was that they were improving overwinter survival and overall health. And that was the driving force why they got involved in backyard bird feeding. They want to help the birds. When they looked at the disease issue, they realized that that was part of nature, similar to some predators. They recognized hawks as being a natural type of a predator and did not have the same type of emotion as when they observed cats being predators. So I think it was a good study. It provided some information on why people are feeding birds, but it still shows perhaps a lack of knowledge about the overall impacts of feeding on that local population. I think it pointed out a lot of issues that would require further research in order to really document what are the population increases or decreases associated with backyard bird feeding. There's certainly a lot of attributes that could impact that, but I think we need a large-scale study looking at those population changes over time as a result of backyard bird feeding. But one thing is fairly clear. Certainly people have a very strong emotional response to predators at bird feeders, and they're willing to take actions to minimize predation by the non-native species, the house cats.
Well, again, these are findings from a rather interesting approach to studying backyard bird feeding and enlisting the help of locals, if you will, citizens, to make those observations. We appreciate the word on this, Charlie. Many thanks to you. Charlie Lee is a wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. He's along our way every Tuesday this same time. And that does close out today's edition. We'll return right here tomorrow and hope you'll do the same. Meantime, a good day to you. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.